Aren't you going to say hello?
Oh, come on, Bucko. Don't you want a balloon?
The Canal Days festival was meant to celebrate the history of a small town called Derry, located in the state of Maine, just 30 miles outside of the city of Bangor. The canal was built in 1884 and ushered in the lumber trade, followed by decades of prosperity. July 1984 marked the 100-year anniversary of the canal's construction, but the week of the fireworks and festivities was marred by a brutal hate crime that resulted in the death of freelance journalist Adrian Mellon. Following the incident, these 3 suspects have voluntarily come in to the police station, planning to give their side of the story. John Webby Garton, Steve Dubé, Christopher Unwin, ages 18, 17, and 15, respectively. The teens are separated into 3 different rooms, where each young man will try to convince a pair of law enforcement officers that Adrian Mellon's death was an accident, that the 32-year-old man simply fell off the Main Street Bridge. What the boys don't realize is that Don Haggerty, a key witness and boyfriend of the deceased, is presenting a very different version of the events. It won't be long before these delinquents change their story and shift the blame to one another. But the youngest member of this trio of delinquents will also try to convince the officers that a mysterious figure spotted underneath the bridge was also involved in the death of Adrian Mellon. 15-year-old Christopher Unwin would go on to claim that the stranger under the bridge was a man dressed as a clown. Using a variety of interrogation strategies, the officers will need to determine whether this description of a so-called clown is a fabrication, a hallucination, or a missing suspect who may have played a role in the murder of Adrian Mellon. Donald Haggerty has just experienced a traumatic event. He has also witnessed the death of a loved one. In such cases, a typical response is to be overcome by grief and/or shock. So it is up to these 2 officers to keep their witness talking. According to Haggerty, this was not Adrian's first altercation with these 3 suspects. The first hostile exchange took place on the Tuesday afternoon of July 17, 1984. At the Bassey Park Fairgrounds. According to Haggerty's testimony, Adrian Mellon won a souvenir hat at the Pitch Till You Win booth, and as the 2 men continued to enjoy the festival, they were confronted by Garton, Dubé, and Unwin. Garton, the oldest of the 3 and leader, called Adrian several homophobic slurs, and according to the young man's own testimony, claimed that Adrian was insulting his, quote, civic pride by being gay and wearing a hat that read, "I Heart Derry." This exchange was about to become violent, but Officer Frank Mackin de-escalated the situation and ordered both parties to separate. Garton and his companions complied, but not before threatening serious hurt in the unspecified future. On the last evening of the Canal Days festival, Saturday, July 21st, Haggerty and Mellon patronized Derry's only gay bar, the Falcon. They entered approximately 9:45 p.m. After finishing their drinks, they left the establishment at 10:20. They walked past the bus stop and turned left onto the Main Street Bridge. According to Haggerty, that was when the teenagers' vehicle screeched to a stop in front of them. Within the next 5 minutes, Mellon would be accosted, assaulted, and killed. Haggerty, a longtime resident of Derry, had been able to identify the 3 suspects by name. For the investigators, they have eyewitness testimony and forensic evidence. What they want from the suspects is a confession and evidence of premeditation. Garton, Dubé, and Unwin arrived at the police station that evening, apparently of their own accord. They must have caught wind of the trouble that they were in, and hoped to convince authorities that they were not the ones responsible for Adrian's death. It's easy to tell that these three delinquents collaborated in order to get the story straight, hoping to present an airtight defense. After being separated, each young man explains the same basic story. According to the teens, they had been driving across the bridge when Mellon and Haggerty had shouted expletives. Garton exited his vehicle and asked if there was a problem. Garton claimed that Mellon seemed to be on drugs. He claimed that Mellon pushed them, and that the boys defended themselves, and that somehow Adrian Mellon must have stumbled backwards and fell into the river. But even before entering the interrogation office, Garton made a crucial mistake. When the officers checked his person for any weapons, they found a switchblade. Mellon had been stabbed 7 times, twice in the testicles and once in the lung. Forensics would later determine that the injuries were in fact caused by Garton's blade. But the police already suspect as much because they begin to ask who used the knife. It's at this point that Garton shuts down. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room downstairs, Dubé also begins to realize that their story isn't convincing the police officers as they'd hoped. His posture, which used to be confident, leaning forward, now shifts back against the wall, a defensive position. He asks for his mother and explains that his stepfather might become abusive if he finds out about this situation. But this gains no sympathy as they continue to ask him questions about the origins of the stab wounds. When Dubé insists upon talking to his mother, Officers Averino and Morrison leave the 17-year-old alone to consider his predicament. The senior-most members of this investigation are Police Chief Andrew Rodemacher and Assistant District Attorney Tom Botillier. They focus their efforts on the youngest suspect, 15-year-old Christopher Unwin. Instead of being confrontational, the men are offering encouragement, even respect. They ask Unwin to retell his version of the events several times over. Gradually, the boy seems more willing to cooperate. And finally, Unwin says something that matches Haggerty's narrative. Unlike his older friends, who have stuck to the narrative only about July 21st, Unwin admits that he and his 2 companions did in fact bully and threaten Adrian Mellon on Tuesday the 17th. Unwin also admits that on the night of the 21st, they had driven to the Falcon Bar, spotted Mellon and Haggerty, and intended to scare them. Pleased with the amount of information they are receiving, they offer the teen a cigarette, continuing to build a rapport with the suspect. Unwin accepts, and as he smokes, his posture changes, a little more resigned, and a little less defensive. After sharing information with fellow police, Officer Paul Hughes returns to the probate office where Garton is now detained. The officer reveals knowledge about the encounter at the Pitch to Win tent, and Garton realizes the distinct possibility that his so-called friends have deviated from their original story. With reluctance and speaking softly, Garton admits to being prejudiced against gay people, and, like Unwin and Haggerty's testimony, confirms that the I Heart Derry hat was the catalyst of the boys' hostility. This puts Garton's motivation on record, another win for the officers. In the other room, Dubé's loyalty to Garton begins to wane. He shifts the blame to their leader. On the last evening of the fair on July 21st, John Garton attempted to win his own I Heart Derry hat, and when he failed several times, Dubé began to tease him, saying, quote, "You can't even win a queer's hat." The officers here will adopt the same speech and the same derogatory language to further establish a connection between them and the suspect. As Unwin finishes his cigarette, he provides more details about the events that took place the night of the 21st. He explains that after Garton failed to win the hat, the 3 delinquents decided to drive past Derry's sole gay bar in search of trouble, more specifically in search of Adrian Mellon and Don Haggerty. Dubé drove. Garton was in the passenger seat and Unwin in the back. Garton spotted the couple walking towards the bridge. Dubé pulled up next to them. According to Haggerty's testimony, all 3 teens initiated the attack, unprovoked. Unwin's statement is similar, though he claims he did not participate in the physical assault. Adrian Mellon was punched and kicked numerous times, and stabbed in several places. Then Dubé began to chant, "Bums rush, bums rush." Garton and Dubé lifted the severely injured Adrian and threw him over the bridge. He dropped 23 feet into the shallow water. Garton and Dubé returned to their vehicle, but Unwin remained at the railing. He looked down into the water to see what had become of Adrian Mellon. And here, in the interrogation room, Unwin's body language becomes very erratic, almost shaking with fear as he attempts to explain what he saw next. He claims there was a man dressed in a clown suit, pulling Adrian to the far side of the river. According to his testimony, the clown had sharp, enormous teeth, quote, like the lion in the circus. I think it bit him in the armpit, like it wanted to eat his heart. During any mention of the clown, the officer's body language changes. They are disinterested in this part of the boy's narrative, either disbelieving it or writing it off as a drug-induced hallucination. The assistant DA has heard hundreds of confessions, and he's very familiar with what's known as one-armed man syndrome, a phrase inspired by the 1960s television program, The Fugitive. The one-armed man syndrome is used to describe a suspect's behavior when they try to introduce another participant involved in the crime. It is often a strategy criminals use to eschew guilt, but it's almost always a fabrication. However, what investigators don't realize is that down the hall, Don Haggerty is testifying that he witnessed a similar clown, thus corroborating Unwin's description of the events. While his boyfriend was being stabbed and beaten, Haggerty cried for help. At first, no one answered, but then he heard a strange giggling sound and a voice mocking him. A voice that came from underneath the Main Street Bridge. Haggerty describes the clown as a cross between Ronald McDonald and Bozo. He had tufts of orange hair and wore a baggy suit with pom-poms. Don Haggerty claimed that the clown held on to Adrian so tightly that he could hear his boyfriend's ribs breaking. Haggerty also claimed to see thousands of balloons floating underneath the bridge. Each balloon had the same phrase, "I heart Derry." Authorities found no evidence of a clown or any other person, but the assistant DA knew that this narrative could potentially complicate his case in court. That may have been why, instead of charging the suspects with first-degree murder, the district attorney ultimately pursued lesser charges. The police now have everything they need for an arrest. As to a conviction, they would need to wait until their day in court. In November of 1984, John Weber Garton was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in Thomaston State Prison. Stephen Bischoff Dubé was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in Shawshank State Prison. Christopher Philip Unwin was tried separately as a juvenile and convicted of second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 6 months at the South Wyndham Boys Training Facility, sentence suspended. All 3 sentences were appealed, and each teen was released after very little jail time. Journalists from outside of the community were baffled when Garton and Dubé were released on appeal, their sentences pending. But residents like Don Haggerty were unsurprised. To him and others, Derry has always been a town that looks the other way, especially when faced with the presence of evil. And so we are left with questions. Was there another man under the bridge? Adrian Mellon's autopsy, in addition to the many other injuries, showed signs of bite marks, some of which did not match the dental records of the suspects. One mysterious bite in particular had taken an enormous chunk from Adrian's armpit. The bite marks seemed enormous, perhaps not even human. So again, who was the clown? Or perhaps a better question, what was the clown? Podcaster George Hatfield reached out to Don Haggerty, now a retiree living in Florida after a 35-year career in engineering. Haggerty did not want his voice used, but he was willing to talk with us. He was asked if he still recalled the image of the sharp-toothed clown and the 1,000 balloons. He said yes. So I'm wondering, how do you interpret what you saw that night? And do you think it might have been a hallucination, or a ghost, or an evil spirit, or was it actually someone dressed up in a clown suit? Haggerty explained that to him, the clown would always be the embodiment of Derry. And yet to some, the clown is more than a symbol, because this is not the first sighting of a sinister figure, and unfortunately, for the citizens of this seemingly cursed hamlet, it would not be the last. Thank you for watching and listening to the Stephen King Book Club. This is the first in our series of Derry-related episodes. And if you are hoping to explore this town just a little bit more, stay tuned.